Thanks for joining us for this episode of Coffee with Closers, where business leaders share insights on how to build businesses from the ground up and best practices for innovating in their industry.
Hey, James, I'm super excited to have you join me for this episode of Coffee with Closer.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Happy, what do they call it? Friday Eve, I think it is, right?
Well, I know, obviously you've been in the sales industry for a while and you've worked at some really large companies, including IBM. But for the audience that may not have heard of you, can you give a quick overview of what your career has been like and who you are?
Yeah, sure. So my name's James Denker. I've actually had the pleasure of working with Sam and his brother in different capacities and different organizations over the past, maybe 3 years now. So time is starting to elude me as I get older. A little bit about myself. I've been in the technology ecosystem for about 10 years in different disciplines. So I really started off getting my technical equity and acumen at IBM. I started off the old school road warrior consultants is what saved IBM in the 90s, getting away from hardware into these, higher profit margins and kind of providing more advisory on how to create solutions. So I had an opportunity, working at AT&T as a rebadge contractor for IBM, and we were helping with their digital transformation, getting away from legacy systems and architecture. So a lot of technical project management, going in from a sales consultative perspective and giving more of like a holistic approach of how they could define what that minimum viable product may be and how that can mature into a future growth state. So I did that for 6 years. And what got me into partnerships is pretty cool. I found a softball thing on the TV, and it was like, hey, we have a huge softball organization, but it kind of dwindled down over the years, as you can imagine, from the 90s consultants, the early 2000s consultants back in the day. And it's really kind of taken more of a leaner approach in those organizations. So what got me into channel partnerships and e-com is like, what if you can bring the executives from AT&T and IBM and put them together behind the big desks, behind the big offices, and find ways to collaborate. And we had great success there in terms of decreasing escalation tickets and improvement in terms of engagement and RFP opportunities, roughly about 10% uplift. So, and that was the change agent for me. So then that brought me into e-com, working in MarTech, marketing automation, email, SMS push, growth marketing, lifecycle marketing, retention marketing. Then I got into a review space, Digital moving into Trustpilot, which inserted my relationship with one IMS of how we collaborated, accelerating KPIs to drive traffic to specific landing pages and websites. And then I kind of turned into a general contractor here at Imagination Media, vetting all these technologies and providing, this concept of unified commerce as it relates to connecting siloed technology and improving business processes to give not only the merchant peace of mind, but the consumers that they provide the state of mind. So 10 years in tech, and I was a pilot before that, and I flip houses once in a while. So that's a little bit about me. And I'm happy to be here and contribute to your Coffee with Closers.
Most certainly. And obviously, you mentioned we've known each other for about 3 years, but oftentimes I think we've talked about this whole concept of empathy in sales. And, not every relationship or every interaction that you see as a sales opportunity or seeing them as a prospect, but really trying to add value, right? So talk to me about that whole concept that you and I have talked about in the past as well, the whole concept of empathy in the sales function.
I think it's pretty easy if you're on the receiving end to disseminate between a company that puts you in their sales funnel or actually trying to help you. And it's kind of like how account management upgraded into customer success, or how it's translated from the B2B salesman who would offer coffee and donuts and knock on doors. That's turned into the Sandler method or the Challenger method of how that conversation's been. And a lot of cards are being shown on the table as it relates to what those talk tracks are. And how you kind of bridge the gap to me is not only having great industry and domain knowledge about what you're talking about, being agnostic in nature in terms of how you're providing that skills and expertise to kind of replicate yourself and have that mirror effect that, hey, I want to be in the same shoes, the same seat as that aspiring merchant and what those future states look like of how I can accomplish it. If you view it in that sense, it's a much more easier conversation to have. It doesn't sound transactional. It shows that you're going with a value-driven approach first. And that, to me, instills kind of like how my dad started his business, starting a small business in the hardware space that he took over from my grandfather. It's all relationship driven. So that is not transaction at the very least. So that is a common narrative that you can almost never get away from. And while sales are always important, the message, the delivery, the content, the tone, and the message and the value is all kind of bundled into one opinion. And that's really important in terms of how that delivery comes across. So adopting those industry trends, making sure you're staying ahead of what those new sales techniques are, making sure you're consultative and you're assisting in that sales pipeline, to me, is really an amalgamation of what empathy and what that moral compass should be on how you should approach, an opportunity.
Most certainly. But what about the fine balance between you still have to create, meet your quota and create urgency and close the deal. Meanwhile, you still need to be very empathetic about this prospect stage in the buying process, right? Whatever the issues that they have to go through and whatever executive buy-ins that they have to get and all those things. And you still, you can't go and tell your VP of sales and sales manager, like, well, I'm being very empathetic with my prospects to make sure they got all their answers before they make that decision. So how do you draw that fine balance? That's the tough part.
That is the tough part. And I think that's, develops a little bit of leather skin as it relates to maybe having a little bit of a poker face and knowing how to manage stress and manage the people sitting on the other side of the table. So the first is, the empathy, having the right approach and not making it feel like it's a part of the transaction process. But that builds relationships, and building relationships ensures a better chance that you're going to be able to, consummate that deal or consummate that relationship. I think consultative selling may extend the actual deal pipeline a little bit, but it actually has stronger opportunity cost. So I think it's a manage of striking that balance of saying that, hey, I went to this horse race and I know that this horse is going to win. They already won the Kentucky Derby. They're probably going to win the next one. So that my historical approach is proven to me. This consultative model is going to work. And I have a pretty good approach in terms of how I'm executing my means and methods to get to point A to B. And while I'm expressing this type of opinion and position to my VP of sales, I hope that they're staying on the cutting edge of how it relates to connect with your audience and adopting these new. I think JD Consulting is another one that's coming through the pipeline. I see people on LinkedIn adopting these certifications to incorporate into your strategy. But at the end of the day, it's like everyone's just a component of their past experiences. So if my VP has that same experience that I do, it's going to be an easy conversation. But if not, it's going to be a cold sidewalk that you have to try to find a way to warm up. So if, for example, you're on the same page, it's an easy conversation. You just go ahead and continue what you're doing. But if not, and it gets kind of awkward, maybe offer and show him insight to the data that's proven in the Challenger and the sales and the Sandler method of why things have changed the way that they have, and open his mind. Because if you're a good manager, you should be open to those next level of agreements and just being collaborative and, check the ego at the door. And I think they're between those types of dialogues, between matching that persona with your prospect and then matching the persona with your manager, is where the balance sits, and it's just trying to connect on that level so they can, agree to finding that common ground.
It's an interesting way to look at it. Obviously, like you said in the opening, that you are a trained pilot and a pilot instructor, which is an interesting fact about you. And I'm just curious to learn what kind of correlations have you seen between you being a pilot and having the training to being a professional who's in the field selling and servicing clients, right? I'm sure there's some sort of a relationship you can see between the two functions.
It's an interesting connection. One thing I will say is, when you're flying, you're developing this really rare sense of trust with someone. Something that I don't think I've ever experienced outside of maybe just family. And you develop this bond that you're like, all right, the plane's usually good. The pilot is who I have to put under the microscope to see if I feel like they're going to get us to point A to B comfortably. So that level of confidence and comfortability is at an all-time high. It's 10 out of 10, 12 out of 10. And I think as you crawl, walk, run in your business relationships, you might be able to get there at phase 3 of your partnership or phase 3 of your client. It's a much longer-tailed process. So there is a harmony there, but you're basically, making a much faster decision as it relates to being a pilot and flying with somebody. But as it relates to maybe the process, like take checklists, for example. Checklist to me is a good muscle memory activity that people go through. And as that relates to your sales pitch, almost every sales guy has a very similar approach. You know what I mean? They develop their elevator pitch, they go through their discovery, they come with their solutions, and everybody has a little bit of a different color in their Crayola box to paint a certain picture. But what separates the winners from the losers is having conviction in their voice, having that domain and expertise knowledge, and that relates on both fronts. Having the technical acumen of how the plane works, when to expect and get ahead of the plane, how to deal with an emergency, how to put out a fire when you're on a sales call. And that all kind of comes down to the fundamental roots of how it relates to where your structure sits. And that to me is the checklist. So if I have, brain fog and I didn't have coffee today, I'm going to go and refer to my playbook when it reverts to sales. If I'm in a plane and I need to set up for an approach to landing and I forget a step along the way, any FAA trained examiner is going to tell you the first answer you're going to say in pilot school is refer to your checklist. But you don't want your prospect to make it feel like it's a checklist. That's the magic, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing is, obviously pilots fly, thousands of hours, but they just never act out of just the brain memory either, right? And I think the common pitfall that most salespeople fall into is like, okay, I've had that one sales training class. I don't need any refresher, right? Like I think, you've referenced Sandler a couple of times in the Challenger Sales Methodology. One of the things that Sandler Methodology teaches is the mastery aspect of it, right? I think, most salespeople don't want to sit in on a mock call or doing some sort of a mock demo and doing those kind of things, right? Because they feel like, okay, I already know how to do this. I don't need one more mock call trying to learn how to do conduct a sales call. But I think there's a level of mastery that you achieve by just repeating certain things or addressing a certain type of an objection or all those things. And that's part of what sales, like the training in pilot as well, right? They go through all these kind of different scenario-based experimental flights, right? What happens if you had a bad weather? What happened if you had, one engine just died? So I'm sure those are things too that you probably can find as a way to relate to sales.
That's really weird. That reminds me. So this is like 11 years ago. I was selling document management, copiers. That whole old school B2B salesman is the epitome of that world, which is definitely changing, and the Iron Mountains of the world is changing. And it reminded me of a session we sat in, and we had trainers come in and talk about new training technique. And it was funny talking about people that's on their 2000th flight. They don't want to refer to the checklist, or a pilot who's had he's a captain and, he's always the one, distributing orders. It's hard to have that reverse layer of command and go back to them and tell them to do something differently. So it's almost like, how do I teach an old dog new tricks? And the same thing applied to that copy or sales methodology when we were in the room going through that exercise. And it wasn't the young people that were pushing back. It was the old people that were pushing back. And that was just their habitual instinct to just stay in their comfy side. I don't have to cold call anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So I think after that session, it really changed the way that they looked at something, and they realized that they pigeonholed themselves into a certain playbook that they haven't experimented or taken the dust off the cover to kind of reimagine what the possibility could be on modifying or improving that model. So I think having that growth mindset is something that is a constant challenge when you get more tenured in your career, because people are like, oh, I don't need that. And that's usually where you start falling short and your competition starts getting ahead of you. So it's just like being a captain on a plane. You got to learn, the new technology that's coming in, or you're going to get beat by your first officer. Same thing would apply to any type of technology or business development professional who gets pigeonholed in their own reality. And I think that's something to be really mindful of. And it just, after 58 or 62 days, something turns into a habit. That's hard to change. So the way that I give suggestions is you don't have to change the whole thing, but be open to change 10, 20, maybe 30% of it. So you still have your base. You do a little A/B split testing on what's new, and then see what the results are to better improve what that result may be.
Yeah, and I had Mark Roberge of HubSpot, former CRO of HubSpot, as a guest a while back, and he talked about in the early days of HubSpot when they were hiring, 10s and 20 at a time of sales reps, they did very in-depth study on what made a really high-performance sales rep. And they came up with like 7 different characteristics. And the one surprising one that he found was coachability. And the thing is, you would think it's the ability to address objection or product knowledge or the ability to conduct a good discovery call and all those different things would seem like on the top list of characteristics. But he said the people who feel like they arrived and they got it figured out and I don't need your input and don't correct me, I know what I'm doing, that mentality is not really good for a really high performance sales rep. And I think that's where, like you just touched on, like the older you get in the field, you feel like I don't need your input. And it's like you said, if that's only going to work against them in meeting their quota or even exceeding those quotas, for sure.
Totally. I totally agree. I think we all kind of struggle with that at some point. And it's, it's like entrepreneurship. You just try to fall forward, and, everything that you learn from it is, a lesson instead of a failure. And having that positive mindset will definitely help you be more open to be coachable, right? But I know Mark, I've seen some of his pieces, and I definitely appreciate his content as well.
Yeah, he's a very, very bright man in terms of his ability to build an amazing sales organization. So obviously you've been in a lot of different sales organizations, and you've been around sales leaders, and you've also built your own sales team. So you have a lot of experience in building a high-performance sales culture. Are there any examples or experience that you can share our audience of what have you seen working in building an amazing sales culture?
It's probably just getting ahead to the point where you're comfortable in sharing your own knowledge, right? Like if you're like a senior developer, no one's going to respect you if you haven't done coding before. You know what I mean? So if you haven't done sales before, and you're like a sales manager, because that happens more than we think, there's a lack of credibility. So the first requirement is you need to have the dirt under your fingernails for that respect. The second piece of it is once you understand it, you're not, you'll be a part of some of the discovery, closing the deals and that kind of stuff, and coming in where you need to. But it's not about you anymore, right? It's about the team. So it starts bringing back the coachability component. You have to look for that in candidates right off the bat. You're going to come to disagreements on stuff, but you need to have that open mindset, that growth mindset, and you got to look at what motivates people, and then trying to find what those hard and soft, tangible skill sets are within those individuals, and how you can bring the best out of them through positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, it kind of goes back to like the Roman days where people were like, dictating through fear. And I think that only goes so far. You really need to have that open mindset, that compassionate management that like LinkedIn brought in a couple years ago, and showing that empathy. And you have to find, like, everybody has a love language, everybody has a sales language, and you have to figure out what that language is to match those personas. And it's different for every person on your team. Some people get motivated off of money. Some people get motivated off of giving a great customer experience. Some both. Some are totally different. So understanding your landscape, how to apply those latest technologies, how to communicate effectively with your team, having your team respect you, rewarding good behavior, and empowering the other team members to like not make it feel like it's a project or military style hierarchy, because at the end of the day, you're only reporting to the person above you off of your team's byproducts. You're only a component of the success of your team. So it's less about you and it's more about them. So if you can find effective communication and effective strategies and finding ways to critique in a very open dialogue that everyone checks their egos at the door, that to me is really like the kind of recipe for success.
And you obviously have a lot of experience building organizations through strategic partnerships. You've done that in multiple different capacities at different organizations you've been at. What kind of practical advice do you have for companies that are trying to implement such a strategic partnership model to grow their sales?
That's a crazy space. Partnerships is my common denominator of like anything that I consider in a professional or even personal manner, because relationships is what moves needles. Like here at Imagination Media, we don't do much marketing. It's 90% referral based. And whether it's something that I developed or my founder developed or Justin, who just walked behind me, developed, is really about who feels most comfortable with working with somebody in this crawl, walk, run mentality. In terms of the landscape's totally changed. If you're on the SaaS side, obviously you need the agencies of the world, and it's hard to get to the e-commerce platforms if you're talking about a retail solution. So you need to find some people sell on pain to turn it into a solution, but I look at it as a component more of unified commerce, of how you can provide great customer experiences, and taking a service line. Like let's take one IMS and a review solution provider like Trustpilot. If you guys have a KPI to improve specific branded and non-branded keyword terms for like SEM marketing, and you want to get on that first page, Trustpilot is a great solution because it helps you get to the first page to give that social proof of that top or middle prospect who's trying to vet the company at a brand level, what it's like to work with them. It's trying to harmonize a solution to aggregate the end product. So if it's a one sentence, it's constantly working, being a student of your customers and working backwards from that customers. You can build ecosystems off that. So that's the easiest place to go. Like so that was like Trustpilot, for example. You guys are, the performance marketers of the world. You're working on click-through rates, open rates, bounce rates, all these essential KPIs. And if they move to decreasing bounce rates, increasing time on site, improving, your on-site or technical SEO. So there's higher, there's more check marks on Google's algorithm. So it gets all those. It's like a credit score. You pay your stuff on time, and it just moves above 760 one day. And above 760 is your first page of that landing page. So harmonizing the KPIs of what you're offering and how that technology can attach to it is great. Same thing that would be like for marketing automation. If you want to work with an agency that works on customer journey, you can work on abandoned carts, abandoned browse, VIPs, cross sells, upsells, nurture campaigns, push notifications, welcome series, all those different touch points to either increase subscriber lists, and finding ways to harmonize a solution like an email deliverability software would be great for an ESP, right? Just figuring out what works is how you build that ecosystem. And your message should really be along storytelling, and that's how you win all the time. Storytelling is perfect. Case studies is perfect. Data is perfect. But a combination between working backwards from your customer, figuring out what their needs are based off of their requirements, and then building an ecosystem on it is great. The other part of it is being really patient, because there's a lot of SaaSes trying to talk to the agencies. The agency ecosystem is going through this crazy state of mergers and acquisitions. Same thing for the SaaS getting gobbled up by maybe the e-com platforms of the world, or SaaSes eating up other SaaSes. And it's starting to kind of turn into these big behemoths, and everything's starting to turn into marketing clouds or, service clouds now. So while that market is consolidating, you need to adapt to the times. And we're starting like to get to an inflection point where services are starting to overlap, right? So you need to kind of, hey, we both do email, let's respect the one retainer that one person has on email. And even though you do it, if you're doing Facebook, okay, you stick with Facebook, we'll draw the line in the sand, we do email, and then let's work together to give a great experience to that customer. So those are just a couple of examples throughout my experience that helped me define my market, how my customers has helped me define that market, and how to share a narrative that ultimately improves, what the customer or consumer experience may look like.
Yeah, and you touched on a couple of things. A couple of times you mentioned about the growth mindset, and obviously you certainly have that growth mindset as well. Are there any personal habits or tactics that you use to kind of stay in that growth mindset, and also to continue to build great habits for you as an individual, and especially as a sales leader?
I probably just like staying on the warm side of the sidewalk like everybody else. So it's kind of getting through that and trying to stop being comfortable about what you've developed, right? Mm-hmm. So one ways that I've tried to overcome it is force myself to get, certifications to stay relevant, So like I got my project management professional certificate. I just renewed that. I'm in the process of redoing my certified flight instructor certificate. I just did an e-com certificate for a platform. I'm going to do another one. And that helps me stay open-minded and stay a little bit hungry. And as it relates to motivation or drive or what keeps me moving, probably just foundational, learning from my father, who had his own hardware business, and learning what my moral compass is and how to treat, customers. And you have that, that aspect of you always want your family to be proud of you, and you want to take ownership of what you do, and, just show your parents that there's a good return on investment for their sweat equity that they put into you, that you're independent, you can move forward. And I think it's kind of instilled in all of us. It just gets watered down because we're all just so busy, but never losing sight of that is definitely kind of the part of that growth mindset, and staying close to your roots, and just being as brutally honest with yourself as you can, so you can keep falling forward and wear a helmet if you need to.
And obviously, the one thing we don't all have enough of is time. And I'm just curious if James Denker has any kind of productivity hacks that he uses.
Have good partners, maybe? I don't know. I think time management is important. I think when I got my project management professional thing, I think finding those types of hacks of efficiency, like you learn like critical path method, and that tells you if I do an activity, usually in like software development or construction, and there's multiple activities going on, you figure out what has zero float time. So that's your critical task versus stuff that has float. That's probably like my OCD side coming out to play there a little bit, but that's a very textbook style of staying, efficient with your time. But the other stuff is just partially common sense, partially just doing your homework on knowing if, you think that horse. Partnerships is like going to a horse race and trying to bet on a horse you think's going to win. What's their past record? Have they won any tournaments before? Is that horse reliable? Is the jockey, did he eat his breakfast this morning? Or, you know what I mean? He may show up late. So it's really like, going to fly a plane, like being a great pilot starts before you get into the plane. It's checking what the weather is. Is there any, TFR, like flight restrictions, or is there a taxiway out? And just trying to get ahead of the plane and yourself. So if there's any advice that I could share is, be mindful of what activities that you're doing, making sure and asking yourself consciously, is this the best decision for the company? Is this the best decision of how I'm being measured and what my goals are? I remember when I was, I think I was at Trustpilot, and they were like, ask yourself, is there opportunity cost in this activity? Is it going to yield X, Y, or Z? And the result of that, is that going to get me close to what the company expects of me? Those kind of things is usually a couple pieces and hacks that I've used to try to stay, productive and efficient.
Yeah, and I think also just asking the question, is it a revenue producing activity if you're in the sales role, right? You can do a lot of activities, but it doesn't necessarily always equate to outcome that's profitable or positive ROI.
Totally.
So that's one thing to keep in mind. Well, James, I really appreciate your time, and thanks for sharing some practical wisdom to our audience, and wish you all the best in your career. And thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, I appreciate your time. I'm definitely an advocate for Coffee with Closures. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy working with you and Solomon, and I look forward to continuing down that same journey. And I hope that this was helpful to your audience, and happy I was able to contribute. Thank you.
And maybe you can pay me back by giving me a free flight instruction class.
Yeah, if you want to come to Florida, absolutely. We can fly in the winter down here. It's pretty warm.
Sounds good. Thank you, James.
This episode of Coffee with Closers is brought to you by One IMS, a leading digital marketing agency helping businesses win new customers. To request a free marketing ROI audit, please visit oneims.com. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. To make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe.